whatever you ask me, I'm going to be just as straightforward in telling y'all what I think. So that
All right.
I'm from an older generation, so you gotta. I don't know all the codes and all of that that goes on. Be very direct about what I have to tell y'all because it's always a crucial moment, but we're in a crucial moment, not just in the history of America, but in the world, and we need young people to bring not just energy and enthusiasm, but we need them to not feel like youth is an achievement. And it's been hard out here. This is nothing new about what's going on.
So one of the things about our student profile in the Cornell Orchestra is that one of the things I'm always trying to figure out as a parent is how to encourage my sixth grader to love music for its own sake and not be sort of the helicopter parent and try to get him to practice, but actually have that love on his own. I can only imagine what it must have been like to grow up with a musical family, with your father as a role model, and your brothers as well, being able to make music with each other. Would you talk about your father's legacy and what it was like to grow up in such a musical family?
It's a good question, but really, when we were growing up, me and my older brother Branford are maybe 3 or 4 years older than our next two younger brothers. It's six of us all together. My fifth brother is has autism, extreme autism. So he's not like a savant or plays music. And he was born, I was 9 years old. And my last brother, Jason, who was playing drums on the clip, he was 15 when I was born. So in actuality, my brother Branford and my older brother was playing soprano saxophone. We played a lot of gigs together. Mainly we were playing popular music and funk in high school. So it was great to grow up with him. He happens to be an unbelievable musician. Of course, we didn't know that growing up, what level anybody could play on, because I was always playing with him. So I think for me, it was a blessing to play with him. So as far as my father, he was so much of a better musician than us, but he was struggling. And we struggled growing up. We lived in dysfunctional neighborhoods, a dysfunctional environment. Nobody really had money. It was a lot of ignorance. And this is before the celebration of ignorance that came about in America through rap and all of that. Nobody was celebrating that. And our family life was a struggle. My father and mother had a lot of problems. And there was a lot of reality in our house that there was other people in the community's house too. So we at least had a father. When I was growing up, guys who I played ball with would always say, "Kid, we come sit in your house to see what it's like to have a daddy." And my father was always really, really quiet, and my mother took up a lot of space. So my mother was very intelligent. But it was not like Disneyland or like Leave It to Beaver. We didn't sit around jamming and doing all that kind of stuff. We did play with our father when we had a chance, but we thought his music, it was old fashioned. We knew we couldn't play. So we weren't under those kind of illusions, but we couldn't play really good enough to play well with him. And the thing I think we learned more from him is that we had so much respect for him because he was so respectful. He was respectful of people with other opinions. We grew up after the civil rights movement, so there was a lot of racial strife. And my father was always the least racial person that we knew. Back when you're in the Black community at that time, you better not even say white folks' name. But my father would always insist on people being equitable. I mean, in places like black barbershops or somewhere where it made no sense for him to take this type of stand, he always stood against tribalism and these kind of thoughts. And we never could understand why. But I think as we grew older, we had an unbelievable respect for him. My experience with him was mainly seeing him play at gigs for no people. So I would go to club after club just to be the youngest person in the club. It's generally, low-level clubs, always some adults. And, when people are struggling, there's always more interest. It's more colorful. If you're around people who are getting high or acting, it's a more colorful environment. So I like being in the environment. I didn't like the music they were playing. Neither did the public. So I would tease my father all the time about, man, you don't have no people at your gig and so on and so forth. But I think over time, when we started to get into high school and get older, my father was such a great teacher, not just of us, but of everybody in our area, New Orleans. We loved him. But even the number of students he had, you'd think he was in a public high school. There was one of the new kind of arts high schools at that time. He didn't have a lot of students. And when it got to around the year 1982 or 83, he got down to one student in the entire public school system in New Orleans who wanted to study jazz. Mm-hmm. So we had a heavy dose of good old American realism. that that helped me a lot as I began to come out there. My father was very pragmatic in his thinking and very he believed in knowledge and in learning. So the thing you're saying when you talk about your son, I was thinking I have to laugh about. My father would never make you practice or any of that. He would practice. So if you didn't want to practice, he was like, man, it's cool. And my one brother who's not a musician is actually named Ellis, like him, was actually his real man. That's who he always hung with and gravitated toward Ellis. And because they could talk about philosophical things. My father was very philosophical. So we saw him practice. And I think the best thing for kids is if they see you doing something. And another thing my father could do, he liked to talk, but he would also listen. So he would check you out when you were playing. Now, he wasn't complimentary all the time, but he wasn't overly insulting. He would just say, all of y'all have said. So, it wouldn't just be geared toward you. And so yet I learned a lot of things from him about examples, He never talked negatively about people as groups. He hated for you to call people they. And I got to make y'all understand what time this was. This was in the early 70s, 60s, civil rights movement. Nobody was in all this political correctness and all of that. And we were in the South, segregated. My father grew up in segregation, and we grew up around a lot of ignorance. And it was just what it was. It's like stuff you see in a movie, you think it wasn't that way. The movie is much less than what it was, negative and positive. Mm. So, I think because we saw my daddy and them and his friends, they would practice and they would listen to music and they listen to all kinds of music. It made us have a much broader viewpoint of, let's say, our other friends who to them culture was football. Or, New Orleans Saints, that was American culture, the basketball team.
So, I was lucky enough to get my first job out of my graduate studies to be assistant conductor with the Louisiana Philharmonic in New Orleans. I spent 2 years there.
So
I know, and the thing that shocked me about New Orleans was that it shocked me how segregated it still was in 2001, and when I was there, and I was just taken aback how far apart the white New Orleans and the black New Orleans was. And being in the symphony, one of my tasks was to put together a park concert, and I got to know a lot of jazz musicians, and I suggested putting together a park concert with jazz musicians, and their first reaction was, "Oh, we don't do that," because they just weren't used to having that kind of collaboration. But I'm talking too much, and my students are always on my case and to let our speaker speak rather than hear me talk again. Would you talk about how your training moved to Juilliard and New York City and what that process was like growing up?
What you're talking about, the prejudice was a defining factor of life, good and bad. And some parts of it was good. So, you can't just present one thing. It's not like if you were black, it's not you clamoring to go hang with white folks. You weren't. You having a good time. And for us, musicians were always less segregated. Not so much classical music, but we had a funky drummer on the funk scene. It was a white dude named Red Bean. And man, if you could get Red Bean on a gig, he was always saying, man, see if Red Bean is available. He would literally be the only white dude in a whole dance, thousands of people. Red Bean would come in there and he'd be the funkiest thing in the room. So, the musicians had more of a kind of freedom, but the place was very ignorant. So I couldn't wait to get out of New Orleans. People sometimes say, why you practice? Man, I would practice my horn 6-7 hours easy because I wanted to get out from underneath that stifling ignorance and prejudice so bad. And it wasn't just with white folks. The black people was ignorant too. So it just the whole thing got to be too much for me, all the years of being in it and knowing it was ignorant, then it was intolerable. So ignorance you can tolerate if you don't really see how ignorant it is, but once you see it. So I came to New York. I thought if I could get in Juilliard, I could leave New Orleans and go to New York. So I made it in the Juilliard. But then when I got to New York, it was very segregated, more than New Orleans. I thought, damn, the North is like this too. I lived in Harlem, man. They were having a hard time in Harlem at that time. And then we had a transit strike, and I had to carry my 4 trumpet case every day from 135th Street to 66th Street, back up to 100 and whatever it is street. And, it was just, but New York was more opportunity to play gigs, more people, more sophistication. But stuff is segregated even now. And I kid y'all not, when I go to these kind of society parties, I've seen the same black dude for 35 years. Ray McGuire is his name. And I see him and I say, man, are we gonna just get to be old men and it's gonna just be me and you in these rooms? So we laugh. But it's just that's a part of it. But that's not the whole part. So I always have to say, you have strife and you have racism, and then you have the opposite of that. Because even in New Orleans, whereas we had a lot of racism, my trumpet teacher was one of my greatest trumpet teachers was a white musician named George Jansen, who came from the North. So he wasn't prejudiced like Southerners. I learned a lot. So he was like a father figure to me. And when I came to New York, there's a great trumpeter named Lou Soloff. He had played with Blood, Sweat, and Tears. He's a short Jewish guy, unbelievable trumpet player, and deeply soulful human being who, if you met him, you had to love him. And if you're a trumpet player, he could play on such a high level. He made all the records in the 1970s with the Fania All-Stars. So you hear all the great Afro-Latin salsa records. It's a great trumpet solo. You think it's somebody, Martinez from Cuba. It's actually a Jewish dude from New York City playing some of the most, just clear. And then when I had a chance to meet him and play with him, he could play classical music, jazz, Afro-Latin music. And he was childlike in his love of the music. And I always equate coming to New York. See, that might be the ghost of him turning my light off. I equate coming to New York with meeting him and talking with him and being in his presence. So, and I did a lot of gigs in New York and played in a lot of circumstances that I wouldn't have. You just don't have the same type of musicians. And of course, I had situations in New York too, good and bad. And but I was around higher level of students. When I got to Juilliard, man, just the trumpet students alone, everybody could play. And then when you start thinking about drama students and dancers, and I would go to different people's performances, I would be like, ooh, man, I could. So, yeah, and I mean, the orchestra was played on such a high level. I remember we played one of my first performances at Juilliard was The Rites of Spring. I mean, they could play it. It was like a professional orchestra, just. And then we played Sibelius Second. We played Hindemith, Mathis der Mahler. What's the correct pronunciation of that? Matthias der Mahler, about Matthias Grunwald, I think. That was an unbelievable. I mean, I could go on and on. Then, I met a lot of good friends who played in symphony orchestras for years, and down through years we became colleagues in a way that was not possible for somebody like my father. So that was a different experience, and very, very fruitful and good experience. A lot of education and learning from students, even more than from the teachers.
I mean, one of the things that I love about you is that you are constantly trying to push the boundaries of classical music and sort of really challenging the field to embrace the American music rather than sort of just relying on the Western canon from Europe. So would you talk about your work as a composer, kind of expand the language of the classical music?
I try to expand it, but I love the European canon, and I love the dedication of musicians. Like I always tell people when they start to try to disrespect Bach and Beethoven and musicians whose music they don't listen to and they don't understand, it's some white people's music or something from. I'm not a fan of any of that. I'm not a fan of any disrespect of greatness in an era that celebrates absolute. I don't even know what to say about it. I always tell people, and I'm not saying it for political reasons, because you're getting stabbed on the left and the right. I don't care whether you're Democrat or whatever you call yourself, you're being made a fool of. But that people can become presidents and they never even read your constitution. That's like now you have musicians who don't even play music. I'm all for amateurism, but damn, at a certain point. And now in addition to this amateurism, people talking on records, they're then gonna turn around and say, Mahler and Beethoven and Strauss and Brahms or old white folks, and they couldn't, first of all, in the cultures Beethoven and Brahms grew up in, they struggled in those cultures. this thought that Beethoven was representing German people. German people weren't killing themselves to listen to Beethoven's music. There were some people who listened to his music. Largely, they didn't like it. They liked whatever was popular at that time. And Bach ended up being reduced to a math teacher. He is the greatest compositional genius in Western music, definitely to his time and to me now. He's reduced to being a math teacher for writing the St. Matthew's Passion because it's too difficult for some boys to sing. So I embrace, the greatness of all of these musicians. And I think that you can add things to a tradition if you understand that tradition. But suppose you're going to come into that tradition and use the instrument like the orchestra and don't study it and don't know it. And you're going to say, well, now we're going to play like some African drum rhythms. Man, you're wasting your time, man. Like, you have to know a lot to integrate traditions and cultures. You have to know a lot to go in a person from another culture's house and exhibit good manners at a dinner. So this whole, well, we're expanding these boundaries. Okay. A lot of times things I've been in experimental, we're expanding boundaries. Most of it has been absolutely sad. And for my own education, I've been trying to figure out how to write something orchestra musicians could play that had like enough jazz and enough American feeling in it to still be viable as that. But if it's not for the instrument and the people who are playing it, you have to get the skill to do that. Mm-hmm. I can't just say, well, y'all can't play this music, so, put a bunch of slashes or whole notes for violins. It is challenging. It's just like it is to bring people together. Yeah. You notice in our country, our segregation remains. It's difficult. Black Lives Matters and all these slogans young people like to chant. Great. I'm all for that. I remember we shall overcome. Did we overcome? So I want let's do some overcoming and not and we don't need all the sloganing and putting it on book bags. And I've been doing that for years. My father always had a saying. He'd be in a barbershop arguing with somebody. He'd be arguing against white folks or whoever they were mad at. And they would be saying we. It was always some we they were identifying. And he would say, hey man, who is we? He say the only we I recognize is somebody who shows up with me to solve a problem. That's we. So I think that the problem we have as a nation, as musicians, is we have to have something worth us working together on. And then we have to go about working on things together with the right mindset. And if I work on something with you, if I bring you a piece, and it's like I asked you what was the correct pronunciation of Hinderman's piece. If I don't know the correct pronunciation and you have to then pretend like you don't know it, man, we're going to have trouble working on something. Because it's just going to keep. So some things you're going to teach me and some things I'm going to teach you. And at some point, you're going to be the one teaching me the entire time. And that's what you hope to have with your students. You hope to teach them and you want them to come back and tell you, yeah, man, but did you think about this? Or did you think about that? It's another thing, a great thing about my father. I could always tell him, man, I peeped this out, or I saw that. Or I said, he didn't feel the need to be my father who knew everything all the time. He would say, man, I have to check that out. Or what's the name of that book? Or I'm going to read that. Or before he passed away, we were both reading the Frederick Douglass book. And I got to the end of it before him. And he said, I said, man, I got to the end of it. You want me to tell you how it ends? He said, no, man, I don't need you to tell me how it. When I first made some money, my daddy was always broke. When I first made some money, I was maybe 18 or 19. I said, man, I'm going to get you and mama a house. I told my daddy that, and my daddy looked at me and said, man, are you a football player? I don't need you to buy a house for me, man. So it's like when you deal with music, when you're coming together with these ensembles, the orchestras are very sophisticated and difficult to write for instrument. Now, the fact that it has lost its way in academia and just it has people writing for it, that they know a lot and they've studied a lot. But what they're talking about is not anything anybody wants to hear about, by and large. That's helped to destroy a lot of the momentum that's in the music of Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Shostakovich. Jazz is just like that. You take New Orleans jazz and the feeling and the thing we had, the musicians abandoned all of that to play music that you can only get grants to play. If that's considered an achievement, okay, but to me, I never thought it. And that wasn't because of a lack of sophistication. It's because we don't have to throw red beans and rice out because we eating sushi.
Yeah, what I loved working on the Blues Symphony with you is that you really treated the orchestra as a way to challenge you as a composer to learn more. And I'm always I know as a teacher I'm doing the right things and I'm going the right path if my students are challenging and asking questions that I don't know. and that we are exploring these boundaries of knowledge together. So I absolutely loved our working relationship on the Blue Symphony, where you kept asking me, and I kept thinking, "Why are you asking me, the composer?"
Man, you looking at scores all the time, and you're looking at them practically. So you're gonna see things. I'm not looking at them all the time. I'm looking at mine. I can study other people's, but when you're studying other, and I mean, I've studied a lot of scores. There are practical things in the score you can't understand. But I want to thank you for the things that you told me, and I also want to say that I learned a lot, and I actually recorded that piece with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and the changes I made because of that workshop that I had with you all made it a lot better than it was, because I could see and hear just practical things I needed to correct.
Yeah, I mean, we really enjoyed that process, and I remember distinctly there was a rehearsal, and it was a passage. It was in 6/8, and there were 30-second notes for the violins, first violins. It was so difficult that I think we had just like called extra sectionals just to work on those bars of music, and so we're kind of, and we had gotten to the point we can kind of get through it, but not really. So we're playing this passage, and you sort of said. And sort of stopped the orchestra and was like, what does this passage mean? And I've been telling the story to the orchestra all the time, since because there are students who weren't in that room. And you talked about the relationship between what you asked the orchestra, what is this? What does a train mean to you? And
Right.
that way of thinking about music, discussing expression, that is such a inspiring moment. So I want to thank you for that, those teaching moments.
Man, thank you. And that's what's in Shostakovich's music too. That's what Stravinsky's music is about too. That's what makes it worth playing. The music is connected to some type of meaning. It doesn't have, it's not representative of something, but it has a meaning. And even a lot of Schoenberg's music it has emotional states of it, and changes of states, and changes of consciousness, and like things like side glances and thoughts and internal kind of rivers and streams. And if you understand that's what you're looking for, you can even play that music with a deeper degree of sophistication and understanding, and the music becomes simpler to play and not more complicated. The more complicated things become, as you know what they mean, that means they're not constructed well.
Yeah, the why of the music is so important for us to know what we're expressing. So
Definitely.
I'm gonna open it up to our students, because they've asked so many wonderful questions. So students, if you're willing to be brave enough, I'm gonna call you out, and then if you could pose the question that you sent in the chat previously. So I'm gonna first open it up to anybody who's brave enough to be the first person, or I'm gonna assign just pick one person at random. You can use the raise your hand function. Colin.
All right. Hello.
Hey, now.
Yeah. My question from a jazz drummer, that is what was it like to work with Art Blakey? Well, not just work with him. I kind of want to know what he was like, because there's many stories about that, and I've heard many funny stories about it, but I wanted to know what your personal take on it was, because he is a
Man,
character, in my opinion.
I can't tell you on a student Zoom call. I can't do justice to him, man. I'm just gonna say this. He's one of a kind. Like he was, man. You saw him do some of the worst stuff and some of the best. Like he was a combination. He made you understand that life is not one way. And he loved musicians, and he loved me. So I mean, he loved me like I was a son. And he would cuss you out if you weren't playing the music right. Well, he wasn't gentle with you. He called you every name under the sun. And sometimes it'd be even colder. When you would play something, he would say, "You're sad." He would say it like he was explaining to you you were sad. And he would look at you all the time, like with a dead expression, you can't play. Another thing he would do to mess with you is he would start naming all the great trumpet players that he played with him. Clifford Brown, Lee Morgan, Freddie Hubbard, on and on and on. Then he would say, "And now you." So, but he man, he could play. I mean, he was a genius, man. I remember sitting up one night in Italy. I was 18 with him Elvin Jones, who was really like a father to me. I spent more time with Elvin even than Boo. I would go to Elvin's house all the time till Elvin passed away. 1 o'clock in the morning, Elvin would call me. His wife, Keiko, was from Japan, and he would always put it on Keiko. Keiko has 2 lobsters in here waiting to be et. So I would go to his house at 1:30. Man, I sit up with Elvin till 5, and he just be talking and all kind of just stories. And because my father had known him and McCoy Tyner in the early 60s, they come to New Orleans. But I remember Elvin, Art Blakey, Max Roach, Buddy Rich, Danny Richmond, Shelly Mann. You know Shelly Mann's playing? You ever hear Shelly Mann?
Not as much as the other ones you mentioned.
Look up Shelly Mann, man. Shelly Mann could play, and he was really funny. So, and it was a couple of other, Mel Lewis, a couple of other great drummers, really integrated, you know. And it was interesting to just see them all, the type of respect they had for Max Roach. Like I didn't know that dynamic. Art Blakey too. And Buddy Rich, just the way they were, man, as drummers, they were all like kings, you know. And I'm a trumpet player, so we don't overly respect drummers. Trumpet first, then drums. But you know, I'm playing with you, Colin, but they were like kings, man. And the things they were talking about and the life they described and how they were as people, they're drummers. And the first thing about drummers is they really have a great deal of intelligence and group consciousness. And they were really respectful and loving toward each other. Not like trumpet players, we always want to fight and battle each other. So they were, yeah. Art Blakey, man, I have to tell you sometime, not on a mass call. It just have to be me and you verbal, not recorded. Then I'm gonna tell you some real stories about it.
Oh, that would be a pleasure to hear. Yeah. But
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, he believed in practicing and he had tremendous independence. You should listen to that solo he plays on Buena's Delight. Do you know that? You know that solo?
Yeah, I heard that one.
It's like I'm gonna find out later. I'm gonna talk with Prof. I'm gonna find out what the exact solo is and I'm gonna send it to you. Okay.
All right, sounds good. Yeah.
Hey man, good luck on your instrument. We need you out there, son. We need people swinging. Don't run from it. Run towards it.
Sure thing.
Listen to some of those interviews Buddy Rich was doing near the end of his life. I've been listening to a lot of Buddy talking because he understood something about how amateurism would take over. And it's interesting to hear older people when they get near the end, when they start to talk, they realize a lot of stuff. Because Buddy Rich was also a child star called Baby Traps in the 1930s. He was second only to Shirley Temple. Okay, a lot of people didn't know that. But you know, Art Blakey, they're all coming from the same thing, just from different perspectives. But Art is the reason I learned how to play. So I love him in an unbelievable way.
All right, I'm gonna go next to Mary. Mary, would you ask your question?
Sure. So let me pull it up. I was watching one of the provided videos, which was at Idea Festival 2014, and I noticed you were talking about how it's important to be like happy internally and stay positive because that affects people around you. And I was wondering how that situation might be different in the current atmosphere with the current situation, both in the United States and in the whole world, as you also fight for change in different aspects.
Well, first, I grew up in a situation so much worse than this current situation that all these situations are good. We didn't have a pandemic, but it was a pandemic of the mind. So for younger people, it's hard to realize and understand just life existed long before the time you're in. And people were struggling with the same things they always struggle with. And we lose people, we have health problems, we have problems of systemic, whatever ism you want to put at the end of it. These things have been going on since the beginning of time. And if you're old enough, you might have been a slave. And some people in the world are slaves now. So I don't, there's my light again getting mad at me. I don't feel any other way about right now than at any time. And what I was talking about then was something my classical trumpet teacher taught me at Juilliard. I went to him for a lesson. I was very contentious with him when I was studying with him as a student. After I left school, I didn't graduate. I went back to see him for a lesson. And I never thought of him as being a person. And he told me his son had died in an accident when he was in his early 20s. My teacher at that time was in his early 80s. He said his son had died, and he said his wife was down the hall from where we were sitting, and she was an invalid. He had to take care of her. And he said that when she died, he was going to be all alone. It was very emotional for me because I never looked at him even as being a person. And I was in his house. I was maybe 21, and he was 80. We're coming from different environments. Then he told me, he said, "You're going to be known as a trumpet player. You're going to be able to make some money, and you might even be famous." He said, "But if you are unhappy inside, you are unsuccessful. Your life will be unhappy." So my advice and my lesson for you, I came to him to learn something about transposition. He said, "I'm not going to teach you nothing about transposition. I'm going to teach you to take care of your internal life. And when you find things that make you really unhappy and things you want to dwell on, learn how to pursue happiness, internal happiness for yourself. And then when you get to be my age, you will look back on your life without any rancor or bitterness, and you will not have spent 40 or 50 years with a lot of pent up anger and frustration." Because he could tell I had a lot of little anger with me. He said, "Figure out how to be happy internally." So that was the thing. And I appreciate you seeing it and remembering it. But that he, of course, has passed away now, but that lesson stays with me. And many times when I wanted to strangle one of my kids, he allowed them to stay alive and me to stay out of jail.
Yeah, I think that ability to have something that's positive and within you internally, and not let outside things affect you is a really powerful way to navigate times like this we're in.
Right. All inside things. These are good times if you're trying to fight against something. Man, if I'm a doctor, I'm happy to go where people have malaria.
Yeah.
Maybe a doctor show up and say, "Man, everybody is sick here." Okay, you the doctor, baby. Let's see. Y'all artists, this is a good time for you, for young people, to create and affect change. We don't need slogans about racism and let's have another training about some Black people that are not here. Make something be different. Work on something together with people you know, and don't be hoodwinked by some kind of racial talk. And all this stuff makes me sometimes I have to shake my head, man. You know,
Right.
some of it is crazy.
We're going to go to Emily next. Emily, would you ask your question?
Yeah, my question was about your expertise in both jazz and classical playing. I've always noticed a difference in kind of like the culture between jazz and classical musicians, and I was curious as to your experience with that and if you ever felt pressure to pick one over the other.
I never felt any pressure. Emily, thank you for your question. I grew up with a lot of pressure on me. So I'm gonna reiterate it. Like the amount of pressure, when Martin Luther King got assassinated, my mother made us go to an all-white school. You have no idea what pressure is. Like to be called all kind of names, and every day you had to deal with that from kids and also adults. But once again, not everybody. I remember I told my daddy, "Man, if somebody called me a word I don't like, I'm gonna fight." Well, let me tell you, when you're losing fights, it gets old fighting. Like it's not a movie. So I remember maybe 2 years into it, man, I wasn't gonna stand for it. So I stood by my word. But maybe in the 6th grade, and let me tell you, we hated going to white schools. We grew up in all Black environments. We had to walk across the tracks and go into their environment and deal with them. And look, it was ugly. But I remember the biggest guy in our class, he was German. He passed away too. His name was John. One day he said, "Man, you gonna fight everybody?" I said, "If they call me these names I don't like, yeah." He said, "I'm tired of seeing this." He said, "The next time that happens, I'm gonna jump in there with you." So, damn, the next time it happened, didn't take long. That's just how people were raised. He was my man in there with me. You see, it's just so. When I think about classical musicians, everybody was always so nice. Okay, they had their little petty prejudice, but they have intelligent prejudice. If you deal with ignorant prejudice, man, when you deal with ignorant prejudice, when you start dealing with intelligent prejudice, you're so happy to have to deal with intelligent prejudice, even though it's more devastating. Okay, it's like the difference between being in the street and standing before a judge. That judge is not going to be like the person in the street. The person in the street is going to beat you up. That judge, you're going to be in jail for 30 years for some weed. So I'm not making light of it. I'm just explaining to you, when I first got around classical musicians, what I thought was, man, these people talk about a lot of different stuff. I was like a 15-year-old student. I was used to playing in funk bands, and there was no real jazz group of people. We, it wasn't a lot of younger people playing real jazz. We're playing kind of funk music that we call jazz. I never thought it was jazz. When I got around classical music, they talked about a lot of different issues. And I thought they really talkative. And so far as prejudice and stuff, yeah, the society is prejudice. Yes, it existed. It exists. It was a fact. But I wasn't so much defined by that when I was around them. I was trying to be able to play good. So they would be saying, the black dude with the afro can play. Like, it was very fundamental. Now, in terms of the differences, yeah, there are differences. There are cultural differences, there are musical differences, but there also are many more similarities. So the question for me and for you and all of us becomes, do we want to ride the wave of similarity that we can get on, and we can ride that wave all the way back to shore? Or do we want to get on one side of that wave and fall in that side of the ocean, or the other side and get engulfed? Some friends I met in classical music have been some of my greatest friends in life. Now I'm at that age. And when I first met them, were they from my environment? No. But this whole kind of way of segregating yourself is to go back to what my father taught me. And it is difficult to play both well. At a certain point, I stopped because I couldn't play classical music on that level. I grew up with my father playing jazz, is what I always wanted to do. But my father loved classical music. So I developed a love for classical music when I was a kid. And I also grew up playing it and playing symphonic gigs. And when I was a soloist and I would just travel around the world playing with orchestras by myself, that was the hardest for me culturally. Because I was 23 or 24, 25. And I mean, I was playing concertos 15 minutes and that was it. So jazz, I'm playing 2 hours a night, and I'm so I would be kind of lonely sometimes, but I met good friends then too. And I decided ultimately to just stick to playing jazz because I was also trying to learn how to play jazz. I wasn't that good at playing it. Because once again, in my time, we weren't playing that kind of music. I was trying to fight for the music and defend the music against that intellectual prejudice. And intellectual prejudice, okay, you can fight with them with newspaper articles. That ignorant prejudice, oof, is going to teach you something. So, I think for me, I learned so much, and I knew so many great musicians and played with them from a young age, of all kind of ilks and styles and kinds, and in classical music. And then later, when I became older, they became more and more jazz musicians. So then, yeah, we had our culture, but they were very different from the earlier jazz musicians. They were more like classical musicians than they were like the earlier jazz musicians. Like the jazz musicians I eventually met, they were nothing like Art Blakey or Sweet Edison. That was another whole. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
No, it does. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What do you play?
I play the flute.
Okay, I love the flute. The person that made me first practice trumpet was a flute player named Kent Jordan. So I always learned the Midsummer's Night Dreams. Little flute part. I learned how to play that just to tease him. So I learned to play it on the trumpet. So I always think about flute and him always looking at me when I was acting stupid, just playing in the flute, looking at me like I had lost my mind. So I love flute players because the way he looked at me made me start practicing when I was 12 and 13. So thank you, flute players.
All right, we're gonna go to Alyssa next.
Yeah, kind of going off that last question, I was just wondering how you found or created your own identity as a musician throughout your career.
I think I always had my own identity. I mean, I didn't like it. So people would say, you sound like Miles, or you sound like, and I would say, man, you must not be able to hear. Miles was never this sad. Or if you think I sound like Freddie Hubbard was never sad as me. I think the main thing is to identify things that sound like you that you might not like, but they sound like you, and work on them. Because, you love the people who influence you, but at a certain point, you have to break up with them to find yourself. And when you find yourself, you find things that you do. And then I think it's also good to tape yourself and listen to yourself and listen to your music and ask yourself all the time, how do I want to sound? And on your instrument, long tones are very good. You do your long tone instead of just thinking about the technical quality of your sound. Think about what do I want my sound to embody? That's a difficult way of practicing. because it requires more concentration. It's much more like a meditation, but it helps you to work on your person. It can help you to be more patient, help you to think deeper into your personality, to be more solidified in your thought. And the last thing I have to say, because of my upbringing and because of how much I had to be by myself and deal with situations myself in my neighborhood with Black folks and dealing with white folks, it made me much more hard-headed. Like I remember once guys in my neighborhood got mad because I had a briefcase. Because in the neighborhood, you got to deal with stupidity too. And it was like, well, we don't want you with this suitcase. Well, that made me more determined to wear my suit, to bring my suitcase. I only had books in it. So it's like, man, if something was mad about that suitcase. So I just kept carrying my suitcase. Well, man, you don't put this suitcase down, you have a problem with us. Well, man, we're gonna have a problem. So it's in a lot of ways, when you have to deal with a really ignorant element, it helps you to understand what undergirds a lot of the kind of animal way people can be. So I waited for the right time. I went down on the corner where everybody was standing and I opened a briefcase. I said, you see what's in here? It was all books. So I would be very aggressive with the ignorant. I said, you see what's in here? This is something that's more dangerous than the fighting y'all doing. But I'm not worried about you being interested in reading none of it. And after that, it was no more talking about the briefcase I had, or, a lot of times your environment, you got to deal with the different elements that exist in your environment to make you remain tribal. And if you don't want to be sectarian or tribal, there's punishments that come with it. So I think when you have to fight for your identity as a person, it makes you more determined first to be more substantive as a person. Like, what am I actually fighting for? If I'm just going to imitate everybody else, I don't have to fight to do that. I can just imitate them. Then it also makes you much more hard-headed when you develop things that you believe in. Like, you're not just going to give them up just because a group of people say you need to give them up. There's one picture I love of a guy, I forget his name. In 1936, everybody is saluting Hitler, and one guy is not doing it. So it's a stark picture. It's like 400 people at some type of factory. Everybody has their hand up, and this one person is. And that picture is a famous picture, so it won't be easy. It won't be difficult to find. What I love about that picture is everybody is going this way. It's fascist, it's racist, it's ignorant, and they all know that it's that. There's a belief that, oh, nobody knew. Oh, everybody's because people were poor. Don't ever believe that stuff. Everyone knew. But this one man is like, I'm not going with y'all. Now, of course, he ended up having a very, very difficult time. His wife was Jewish, and she ended up being killed in a concentration camp. And he had to work hard labor. So his opinions cost him. But I'm sure if you would ask him, if I took you back to that moment, would you throw your sign up? I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have turned his back on his wife and said, "Yeah, I'm sorry. All this anti-Semitism is right. I get along with it." And you got to remember, you're always called upon to take a stand. Now, that stand does not mean just going with any type of whatever. It means being discerning and studying and being for real about your opinions and knowing what's going on. All of you on this call should know 100 and something Republican senators agreed to sign on to some absurdity from the state of Texas to overturn an election that was deemed by people on both sides of the aisle to be fair. And the fact that you're a musician or something doesn't exempt you from knowing about the country you live in the world you live in, because you don't know when you will be called upon to risk your life for something that has greater meaning than your own success. And far too often, we don't rise to that challenge for our fellow human being. And you might look up one day and you might be our fellow human being. So it's always good to be mindful of that as a musician, because you're gifted with the ability to communicate. And the question will always be, well, what are you communicating? What are you telling me? And you all are one of the most, you all are probably the most marketed to generation ever. And a lot of what's being marketed to y'all is absolute pure trash. Develop your ability to discern. They used to have a saying when I was growing up, Shinola was shoe polish. So they would say doo-doo from Shinola, but they didn't call it doo-doo. You have to be able to figure out how to discern between those two things.
Danielle, you're next.
Hello.
Yes.
So I was wondering, what was it like to be the first jazz musician to win a Pulitzer Prize with Blood on the Fields? And also, when you were creating Blood on the Fields, was that something that you felt like you had a responsibility to create, or did something really like spark your creativity or desire to tell the story of freedom?
Okay, thank you for that question. I didn't know about the Pulitzer Prize, and I mean, I never knew really about. I thought it was for literature, so I didn't know it was for music. I'm always honored to receive any prize. When people invite me into their home to cook me a good meal and say, "My daddy's a trumpet player, he likes your music," or "Here's an honor. Can you hear my daughter play?" or "Can you listen to my son play?" I've had that happen over 40 years. So I'm always honored. I'm always grateful, and it's all an honor. It's an honor for me to talk to you, and I'm not saying that in any patronizing way, because I might only talk to you for this brief moment in this time. So I'm looking at you. I'm scrolling through all of these so I can see the people I'm talking to, even though I'm not in person, because it's not something to take for granted. With Blood on the Fields, it was about slavery. When I was 6 or 7 years old, my mother took us to a museum in New Orleans that was called the Cabildo. We didn't live in New Orleans. We lived in little towns like Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, Little Farms, Opelousas. It was really country, segregated towns. We went in New Orleans and went to the Cabildo, and the Cabildo had all slave chains and slave quarters and stories about slavery. Now, eventually, when I was, I think, a senior in high school, the Cabildo burned down, or someone burned it down. But when I went to the Cabildo, they gave us a pamphlet. There was a cartoon pamphlet of the life of Frederick Douglass. We took this cartoon book home, me and my brother, and we're reading about Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass did this, and Frederick Douglass did that. And we're talking about Frederick Douglass and slavery. At that time, we, of course, knew about slavery just because of our family, people in our family, Mississippi, and blah, blah, blah. My grandfather had been a sharecropper. So what is sharecropping? This, that, he's from Mississippi, there's slavery. But when we read that, I became interested in slavery. So when I was in school, high school, elementary school, whenever I had a paper to write, it was always on slavery. So when I wrote, my senior thesis paper was on slavery. That when I was in elementary school, I had to read poetries and all that. It was always something about slavery. Blood on the Fields, it wasn't any responsibility or nothing about freedom. It was a heritage and a tradition I had grown up with. And I read so many great books through the years about slavery. I never knew anybody who was a slave, but my great aunt and uncle were born in my great uncle was born in 1883, and I lived with him when I was 6. And they grew up a generation out of slavery, and they would talk about it. And my great aunt grew up on a plantation, not how plantations existed after slavery. And I'm telling you, I could not imitate my great aunt's voice, and she was like a mother to me. But my understanding of it was good and bad. And by good, I don't mean anything about slavery was good. I mean, if people still live lives and they still experience human happiness, and they still had joy in their children, and they enjoyed the meals they got and all the things that they could do when they could get above the level of just bestiality and of the what's in Frederick Douglass' book is something that we should all read and know about. His narrative life is one of the great classics of American literature. It's so well written. Just that a person who had been a slave could have that type of command of the English language. And the story in the book of how he learned to speak English. I mean, how he learned to write English. And his observations are very acute. And a lot of the observations he made about that time could also be applied to Nazi Germany. So you start to realize you can apply them across time to things that have been done to people. So for me, no, it was not a kind of, it was just natural. And I didn't set out to write it like I'm gonna win awards and that. It was just something I was writing. At that time, people were not writing pieces about slavery so much, or I don't know what was popular. That was at a time when the minstrel show was coming back via hip hop, using all kind of profanity, and everybody was into that. I was always against that, alone, like that man with his arms folded. It didn't matter, because ignorance is a certain way. It's very powerful. It's a very powerful tool. Once it's wielded, you can't, you have to laugh sometimes about it. A good book I always suggest to students to read is a book by Thomas Mann. It's a very short book. It's called The Coming Victory of Democracy. It's speeches he came to America to give I forget the exact year, it might have been 1937, 38, to drum up American support against Nazism. How did that work out? Did he drum up support for it? Hell no. He was in this country telling people, this is what's going on. And that book is a great one for younger people to read, because you can see the response of people to an impending tragedy that could have been averted. But the decisions in the culture were an apathy that ended up costing millions of lives.
Tara, you're next.
Hi, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I had 3 short questions. I think I'll just ask one of them. So in your interview with the King Center, you talk about like how building coalitions is important to rectifying racial injustice. So a lot of our discussions this semester have like focused on the challenges that BIPOC musicians face in professional music settings, especially in classical music. So I was just wondering how you think we can build coalitions for change within institutions like big orchestras that have an affinity for the status quo and like tradition.
You know, I think that for me, people's identity and their sexuality should not be a question in a workplace. So I think if there's a problem about that, if there's a problem about a person, any, like, I mean, I'm trying to find the right word. I'm trying to find the right words to explain what I'm saying. And it's very difficult for me because, you know, when you talk about people in their, when you talk about a person's identity, okay, you say, I'm a Black person, or I'm a indigenous person, I'm a person of color. Man, I'm from New Orleans. I don't know what color you are. Can you play? And what do you want me to do? Like at a certain point, I grew up under such harsh racism that, you know, I don't know. I don't know that I'm of the generation that really can deal with people from the standpoint of, and I put all of the isms together. You notice when I started talking to you, I put every ism: sexuality, religion, race. People want to separate out the whole kind of people of color and all that. Man, I don't. You know, I think where there's a problem, conversation is always great. But the one thing you have to be aware of, and everyone has to be aware of, is the use of victimization as a way to get agency. That's not the way to get agency from people. The way to get agency is to be very deliberate in your exposure of injustice, and to get friendships from all different kinds of people, and you all together say, we recognize this, and identify what my father said again, what are the problems and how can we address it? A lot of times people just want somebody to tell them they're sorry and hold their hand and say, what, you know, I went through that in the 1970s. So I'm much harsher about it. You know, okay, so people held my hands and they said, man, we're sorry for what we did, Black folks. And grants were given out and people got into college, people like me. You know, the Black president is gonna solve everything. There's always been these things that's gonna help everything. Well, let's just get together and we're gonna give $200 million to this. You're gonna stop all of these movies? And also, what are the people of color's responsibility to their own cause? You're gonna stop calling yourself an N-word on records? You're gonna start referring to women in the terminology that you have? Are you gonna stop? Like, what is the recipient? What are we, let's get in real time. If you wanna see change in something, you change first. So but I am older. So in this environment of just kind of the politics of words and all this stuff, I'm not adroit at dealing with this terrain. You know, because this terrain is set up for the reality TV generation. It's set up for the kind of, it's like all the Black Lives Matter statements that corporations put out. Man, they called some guy in publishing place in a publicity said, give us a Black Lives Matter statement. Then everybody had their statement up and everybody was cool with it. You know, and if you say something against a group or you say something that's not what the group wants, all of a sudden it's like you attacked a gang member. So is BIPOC, is that the gang I got to deal with now? Is it Black people? Is people of color? Is it, what is it? It's like the kids in my neighborhood. They don't want you with a suitcase, or, you know, you can't wear a suit. Okay, well, who's the gang now? Well, it can't be us because we're always victims. Okay, well, I grew up with victims and they could victimize you if you gave them the opportunity. You know, so I don't know. Some of my opinions are not good for people of this generation because y'all have a sophistication with words. Y'all grew up Twitter and Facebook and people have friends and likes and all of that. I have to be honest with you, I don't have any of that. I'm not interested in it. I don't know who's popular. I don't even care about it. When I state an opinion, I don't care what's popular. All I know is that I'm not against any group of people for who they are. You know, that's what I can tell you. And if you can get some agency or you see some injustice, get with your friends who don't believe in it and change that thing. And if you change that one thing, man, that's a lot. But don't get a slogan or a patch or something like that. Don't do that. Make something change. And it could be anything. And when you make a change, don't make a change so that you get to be the one that doesn't have to do their homework on Thursday. That's some more patronization, man. That's like how I saw coaches destroy Black ball players. When I was growing up, man, you had a Black coach, you couldn't do all this talking and all of that. Man, when Black ball players start to leave the hood, it's, well, that's how they are. That's how their culture is. No, man. We didn't have all of that. So, you know, sometimes it's generational. And you all also have a pipeline of filth. I asked my students at Juilliard, what do y'all think is the biggest difference between my generation and yours? I'm thinking they're going to say something about the computer, the internet, and they said pornography. I had to laugh. I wouldn't think about it. And they would say, well, what access did you have to pornography? I was like, none. We didn't have that. Kids, we didn't. And they said, we grew up with it, computers and it, you know, so the terrain is different. And when we're talking to younger people on a terrain that's filled with adults who have exploited you since you were born, I don't know. I listen to y'all. You tell me something. If you explain to me what your position is and I can understand it, I give you my best advice. But I really can't. The terrain is just too different. You know, it's so much exploitation going on, and there's so much skillful use of tools by people who are really intelligent macro thinkers selling stuff to y'all for such a long time. Since before you reached puberty, you had somebody reaching into the most innermost part of you, your sexuality and everything else, and they were exploiting it to sell products. In my generation, we had our problems, but you couldn't do that in that time. So I think the solutions to these problems will come from you all. Does that make sense? That's a long answer. I know I'm kind of going off a little bit, but it's kind of.
No, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that there have been many, many things that are really done in the service of making things better. But in fact, it's, you know, for example, a lot of orchestras put out BLM statements, but are they really changing the way they choose repertoire? Are they really changing the way they do business? It's basically a PR stunt. So
right. Right. You know, I'm with you. If y'all want a Black Lives Matter statement, call me. I'll write one for y'all. No, right. They're not changing anything basic. But a lot basic is going to change. Y'all have to change it. There's a lot more money going towards it. That happened in the 70s. And a lot of people stole money, Black people, or people who in whatever group it was. A lot didn't. So always remember, it's no one way or the other. So you see there's money, there's issues. Get in there and make it be something substantive. Not just some Black Lives Matter slogan or whatever. There's going to be another slogan in 20 years.
Yeah. Genuine change. Yeah.
Yeah, change. Change it. Change it with your life. And it don't have to be painful. My man who jumped in for me, there was a German dude, it was something at stake there. And he still said, man, I'm tired of seeing this. We got to change this. And you know what? After that day, it changed. It was like, man, we got to deal with him too. 2 is too many. Even for 7, it was like, even 7 of us ain't gonna take a chance with that 2. That was one person.
Okay, we're gonna go to Michael next. Michael, go ahead.
All right. Thank you for coming to speak with us, of course. And the question I wanted to ask is, I was looking through the pages of Jazz at Lincoln Center, and it talked a lot about the special qualities that make jazz amazing, like it is. And I was wondering, what are some of those qualities, or what are some of the qualities that make classical music special, and also how can classical music or jazz learn from each other to make both of them even better than they already are?
You know, jazz has already learned a lot from classical music and the foundation of it. But let's just say, let's take just the consolidation of different instruments into an orchestra. You have Turkish instruments, the war instruments, the drums and trumpets, now they're in orchestra. You have string instruments coming together with woodwind instruments that were with also noise makers, woodwinds, oboes and stuff. They're just making noise at a certain point. Now they come together as part of an orchestra. All the different families and how they talk to each other. Then dance music. You have all these kind of pieces. You play Sarah Bond, and different type of. Then you have the Waltz King, Strauss. Then you have on and on about the dance tradition alone that is in classical music. That is still a viable part of the tradition, even though, except for Vienna, people don't capitalize it the way they should. Then you have the tradition of the music that is ceremonial. Every graduation, they're playing Elgar's music, or that's a part of the music. Then there's the dramatic part of the music that Richard Wagner elevated to its highest standard, and people still use the orchestra in films, and not just in films and opera, and in the exposition of emotional states in the human soul. Then you have the question of virtuosity, which Paganini and that musicians of that ilk, who there were many in America playing cornets and trombone players like Arthur Pryor. And you have the whole keyboard tradition, which is in classical music, which goes back before Bach. And you have the interaction of voices, like in fugal writing, and the way a top can talk to the bottom, which is the discovery in classical music. Make the middle go dit, 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 and then the top and the bottom can talk to each other. And then there are the states of emotion, like in Schoenberg's music we were talking about. And then there's nationalistic colorations that you find in something like Russian music, like Shostakovich's music, even though he went through all kinds of changes with Stalin, and Prokofiev's music, and so on and so forth, and Glazanov's music. So, you know, I could go on and on about what things there are in classical music. I didn't even start to talk about specifics of form, like rondo form, sonata form, invented forms that are just long forms that have never existed, or the combination of classical music with other art forms. We could go on and on. There are many, many achievements of classical music. And then there is the thought, which is ultimately what I think about classical music, of a group of 65 to 80 people in a community who sit in silence for that community and play one of the greatest libraries ever on earth for people to sit in silence and just listen to and be nourished orally by minds like Beethoven, Brahms, Bach, Shostakovich, Stravinsky, even people who are far beneath these people's level of acuity. I mean, these people's levels of insight and understanding, their music deserves to be heard. So I think, you know, and with jazz, there's been composers who tried to do something with it. A lot of times the prejudice and ignorance was so great, and the defense of classical music under the rubric of whiteness, the musicians didn't do that. George Gershwin didn't say my music is white. Leonard Bernstein didn't say this is white music. I talked with him. Somebody else is saying this is white music. Now, you can't say that like people can say this is black music. You can't say that in the open. But you just make sure that mediocre black music never gets played, or mediocre music by a black person. I really don't know what black music is in classical music, to be honest with you. I would be hard pressed to tell the difference for a lot of composers. But why can't their music be played with all the other music that's not Beethoven and them's music? So I think we have stuff we can learn from each other. And if we listen to the music that's been played already, Stravinsky, he heard a lot in ragtime music. Shostakovich has some music he wrote that's based on things he heard in jazz. Duke Ellington he and Billy Strayhorn's version of Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. Stravinsky did the Ebony Concerto for Woody Herman's band. Benny Goodman commissioned most of the great clarinet music that was written in the 20th century, classical music. We could go on and on. Third stream music with Gunther Schuller, who you know was a great mentor of mine, and John Lewis of the Modern Jazz Quartet. They left a lot of thoughts and in music, when I was first trying to write classical music and stuff that would work with jazz musicians, I brought a piece to Mr. Lewis, and he listened to it. He sat down and spent 1 hour and a half listening to this piece. He didn't say anything. And when he finished listening to it, he told me I wrote too many vamps. He says, too many bass vamps. You got to solve the problem of motion in the bass. And then he said, but there's a lot of solutions in there. So it was interesting to me how he was thinking about it, because he had tried to solve a lot of the problems too. He said, there's some solutions in here. And for you all, there'll be some more solutions. And there's a lot of space for you to solve problems and figure out how to bring these things together. But realize that people have been trying to bring them together and have been bringing them together for a long time.
All right, so we're coming to the end of our time, but I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So I'm going to go to Alex next, and then one more person. So Alex, go ahead and ask your question. Alex, are you there? Okay, let's go to Alice.
I think Alex was on mute. Sorry about that. Okay, my question is a little bit different from the stuff we're talking about now, but a little bit more like the stuff we were talking about earlier, and it's a little long. But I was reading your blog posts from over the summer about the ones that occurred right after the murder of George Floyd. And I really liked a particular couple of sentences that you had. Can we reckon with the idea that the opposite of injustice is not justice, it is corrective assistance? The question that continues to plague us across centuries, decades, years, months, days, hours, minutes, and even seconds. Do we have the will and the intention to get that 3/5 up above 5/5 and create a productive society, the likes of which has never been seen? And I think that this is really important because this answers the question of all the people who say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter. It starts to get at this idea that achieving equality isn't really enough, and restoration needs to go further. And so I'm wondering what you think this looks like in the world of music, and how you think music might be able to be used to create like larger social change.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for reading that, for pulling that quote out. I think once again, slogans are a certain way. Okay. And slogans, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, all lives matter. You gotta remember, I'm coming from a little longer way, which is we shall overcome. The President of the United States of America, who was a segregationist originally from Texas, Lyndon Johnson, said in a speech in 1965 for civil rights, in support of civil rights legislation, we shall overcome. And it's one of the greatest speeches ever given. Did we overcome? We're in the process of overcoming. What I was saying is that when we begin to look at people who are not like us, like I'm looking at you and see an opportunity in the world for development and growth between you and I, and the changes we can create in the world, and that your talents and your abilities and me helping you to develop them is a part of whatever my development is. Now, let's look at people not like you and I. Let's take people who are not educated, people who are ignorant, people who have struggled, people who, a generation is not gonna be enough. That's 3, 4, 5 generations. You're looking at like a cathedral. Now you're looking at something which is like, well, a person who worked on a cathedral in 1350, they might see a wall go up. They weren't going to ever see that cathedral. That was 213 years. Does that mean don't build a wall? Don't set up that? So the corrective assistance looks like to me, in every way that we deal with people and with our neighbors, we start to understand that every person has a potential. How can we unlock that potential, and what will our investment be in the totality of our population? That's one. So far as music, to help Black people, all the music that has the N-word in it and calls women all the names they like to call, everybody's okay with, and all the reductive stuff, and the use of the hood as the plantation, and excusing the kind of, well, that's just how they are, they're from the hood. People need to stop endorsing that. that has nothing to do with being Black. That's the success of a marketing campaign, and it's very successful. It started with movies about pimps that we went to see in the 1970s. My mama hated that, may she rest in peace, and we just loved it. And everything she said in 1975 to me has come to pass. So on her grave, I'm going to recognize that she told me then, if you can get a bunch of young men and people out celebrating an ignorant, low, dirty, and she used very choice words, pimp, what is the next iteration of that going to be? And I'll never forget, my mama loved Tupac Shakur. She always such a little cute boy. I said, yeah. I said, I'm going to send you some of his music and I want you to really listen to his words. So my mama, you know, she she listened to the words and she called me and she said, when? She said, they're going to have unlimited resources now. Now, it wasn't his little words. My mama could curse more than him. And she understood that that type of ignorance was going to get unbelievable support from our culture because it reinforced a stereotype and let out some of the pressure of the guilt from slavery that had come to the forefront in the 1970s. And lo and behold, here we are 40 years later. Now the minstrel era is on. Everybody is a part of it now. We got everybody, self-pimping. So, you know, what I think we can do is we need to stop having an appetite for that. That's not something to entertain yourself with. How many people somebody shot, or how, I mean, it's so ridiculous. I don't want to laugh. Sometimes I have to laugh at it. So, you know, so that's my thought of how to change this stuff. Turn that off. No longer tolerate that.
Okay, so Alex is having his trouble with his microphone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read Alex's question in whole. I have two questions for you. How has your experience been performing online during COVID? Although I've attended open mics, which were dumpster fires, I haven't gotten any perspective about how online performing works for professional musicians. What do you like and dislike about it? As in the online protest video. And then, so let me ask that question first, because then the second part is more complicated. Yeah.
You can't play with people online because of the latency. And so, you know, I played so many happy birthdays online. You know, last night, I love when I scroll through people and their families. Last night, I didn't know the family, a friend of mine said, do this. I like hearing the people talk to each other when they don't know you're on. Well, Inez is my second cousin. And she was, you know, I married, Lucian was my husband. And then this our two children, my grandma. I mean, I just listened to them and talk. And then they said, well, we have a guest on in. It's that young man that plays the trumpet. And you know, he's gonna play for you, Corrine. It's your birthday. And I play it and I scroll through. So I like that. And so I've been teaching more classes in Africa, man. I've people in Kenya, I look into their homes and tell them something about their artwork that I'm looking at and all this kind of stuff. Playing, you know, you can make videos with people. It's not the same as playing with people, but a lot of popular artists, they were making music and not being in the same room together for years. So you put down the track and you do it. We've done a lot of that. That's okay. And for piano players and guitar players and people who can play together in the same space, their family, their spouses, their loved ones, their friends, they play. Emmett Cohen is a guy who's done great stuff online with jazz, with a rhythm section. They get in the room and they swing. I think that's going good. It's what we have. So I embrace it. And I embrace people doing it and trying to get in whatever space we have to communicate with people through music.
We've had the same issue with latency. We really wanted to try to make something where we could play together online, but it's either we can't do it online in the Zoom form, or it involves 50 hours of editing in a studio. Yeah. Okay. I think we're basically coming to the end of our time. I want to just say once again what a pleasure it's been to talk to you. And share with your wisdom about your life experience. I think I'm always so thankful for wisdom from people who have gone through the experience of fighting through a difficult time and what we can learn from your experience. And I hope our students get the sense of their choices that they have to make as they go through their path at Cornell, after Cornell. And they're not going to be professional musicians, but they will certainly be people who will be supporting the arts and justice in our society. And I think what I would love for them to take away from this conversation is that sense of stepping up when it is difficult to do so, because we will all come to those times when we will be going against the flow to step up, to say, this isn't right, or this needs to change. And I think that's the most central challenge on that's laid on our path as a human being. It's easy to go with the flow and not upset the establishment and not upset the your boss, your teachers, your family, and it's difficult when there's a cost that you'll have to pay for speaking up and stepping up.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I want to add to what you're saying by saying that establishment is on both sides. Remember, that gang forms around any thought. It could be Black Lives Matter gang, you better say Black Lives Matter. Or it could be Blue Lives Matter. Don't think that because you're saying Black Lives Matter, you can't be part of a gang, because you can be.
Yeah, I think it's so easy for us to stay in our comfort zone of seemingly safe haven of not having to deal with a difficult issue or question, because we are inundated with messages and needs to take care of, to survive, right? And I think our ability to rise above that, just surviving, and looking at another human being and having empathy for another person's plight is what will make us a better human being. Yeah.
That's right. So, it's not tribal. I want to tell y'all, I've been all over the world. Universal humanism.
Yeah.
People love their children and they do the same things you do. Your parents, that's going on everywhere in the world. They have different ways of expressing it. You're not going to agree with everybody, but the average person is not out here talking about go kill this one and that one. It's not my experience.
Yeah. So what I want to do is end on that message of hope that we're hearing from Mr. Marsalis, that we embrace the ability to rise above what seems like a difficult choice, what seems like a costly choice, that we make our lives in such a manner. You're engaging with people who are different than you, who look different than you. And then you work together with people who you may not have much in common with, but in that process of collaborating, we find who we are as a person, right?
Right. That's right.
All right, I'm going to go to gallery mode and ask everybody to put their screens on, and we'll take a group picture. So please turn your cameras on. And Mr. Marsalis, thank you so much for being here, talking to our students. We're so happy that you spent this hour with us in this time. All right.
Thank you, Maestro.
I'll take 3 pictures. Here we go. All right. Thank you, Mr. Marsalis.
Hey, much love to y'all. Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Handle your business. All right now.